Good morning, my name is Emer O'Reilly. I'm the Workplace Diversity Programme Officer for GLEN, the Gay and Lesbian Equality Network. I want to welcome you all to AIR and to thank AIR, our gold sponsor, for hosting us here today. I'm delighted to see so many of you here for the workshop, and indeed there are people from not just in Ireland but also around the world who are logging on to the webinar today to learn more about the Workplace Equality Index. The Workplace Equality Index, as many of you know, is a benchmark for employers to measure their progress on LGBT diversity and inclusion in their workplace, and also to tackle discrimination. It's a really fantastic benchmark to support employers at every stage of their journey, so they can progress and achieve higher performance on LGBT diversity and inclusion. So today the workshop will be approximately an hour long, and I'll share insights about completing the Workplace Equality Index, and some learnings from the participants from last year as well to support you complete the index and get the best out of it ultimately as well. So to begin, last year in 2015 we launched the Workplace Equality Index, and we announced the top 5 best places to work for LGBT diversity and inclusion. We also had leadership awards, and we had a special recognition award as well for trans inclusion, which Trinity College Dublin won. These organisations are really good examples of participants that both excelled in terms of their actions and impact on LGBT and diversity and inclusion, but they also submitted really fantastic submissions as well. So throughout the workshop, I'll share some of the tips of how they produced and submitted really excellent applications for the index as well. So just to give you a little bit of information about the Workplace Equality Index application form itself, it's broken down into 5 sections. So diversity leadership, inclusive policies and practices, diversity culture, LGBT visibility, and diverse business. So this really covers all of the actions and operations of an organisation and where LGBT diversity and inclusion crosses over with these sections. We want to support organisations, whether they're private sector employers or public sector employers, at every stage of their journey. So we've broken down the questions into 3 levels, which are foundations, next steps, and best practices. So this really supports organisations monitor their own progress over the years when they apply as well. Some organisations may only focus on foundations and next steps. They may have some best practice, but they may really look at really doing well in the first 2 sections, or indeed some organisations may look at foundations and say, this is what I want to achieve this year, we're at the start of our journey, and maybe we'll have some next steps, but we really want to complete foundations. The structure of the index, as I said, was broken down into 5 sections, and the 5 sections are weighted according to the section. So we looked at best practice in Ireland and where organisations in Ireland fall, and we allocated the percentages to that. So diversity leadership and policies and practices have quite a significant point allocation at the moment. Policies and practices, for example, in 2015 was a section where organisations did okay, but they had some work to do. So this kind of tracks the progress of where organisations are in Ireland. And certainly internationally, organisations that participate in LGBT diversity and inclusion indexes, we see that over time their progress changes and the areas that they focus on change as well. So the Workplace Equality Index has a cycle of 2 to 3 years. And every 2 to 3 years it'll slightly shift and change in terms of the level of the questions, and organisations will move along with their progress with that as well. The 6th section, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, is an optional section, and that's leadership awards. And we invite organisations to nominate individuals or networks, LGBT employee networks in their organisation that go above and beyond when driving LGBT diversity and inclusion in their organisation. So this is a real opportunity to nominate those people and those networks that have been really making a huge change and difference to the workplace culture and driving that agenda. There are 23 questions in total in the Workplace Equality Index application form, and it's a series of multiple choice questions as well. So I'm just going to move on and share a little bit about scoring and results. So we have a robust scoring framework that we developed and built in partnership with our international partners. So each section is scored by the GLEN Diversity Workplace team, and it's evaluated by an external evaluator who is Cara McGann. She is the Senior Policy Executive in IBEC, and she evaluates our scoring, so we have an extra measure, a check, to ensure that all of the organisations that participate have an objective score at the end, and that it's fair and transparent as well. Each organisation, once they participated, will receive a report card, and this report card will give organisations metrics on how they fared across the board. It's also broken down across foundations, next steps, and best practice as well. So this really allows organisations to identify where those gaps are for the following year, so they can make positive changes and improve for the following year. And to supplement that as well, to really support organisations on their journey, we also have executive debriefs. So we meet with organisations and we look at planning for the coming year as well. So now we're just going to move on to a sample question to give people and participants an idea of the index itself and what's required from organisations. So here we have a question that's from the communication, so from inclusive culture, section 3. And the question is, how has LGBT equality and diversity and inclusion been communicated to all staff in the organisation since January 2015? And here you'll see this is a foundations question, and there's an example of a multiple choice question here. So it's question B is LGBT related articles are disseminated in staff newsletters or other organisational publications. Underneath you'll see that there's an icon for evidence required, and where you see this icon in the application form, you're asked, or participants are asked, to submit evidence. The evidence is generally a screenshot of an article or an e-zine where you have an LGBT inclusive article. And to give you an example of the type of evidence that we are looking for, here you'll see 2 examples of e-zine articles from 2011 that we've taken just to illustrate what kind of evidence we're looking for. We are only looking for one piece of evidence, so it's sufficient just to take a screenshot of a newspaper or newsletter article and include it in the submission form. Just to note that this year all questions in the survey refer to the period 1st of January 2015 to June 30th, 2016. And that means that participants can give evidence only in this time frame, so evidence outside of that time frame won't be scored and it's not eligible for the application. I'm just going to move on to a next steps question now from the policies and practices section. And this is question 2B. How does your company ensure that all benefits offered to staff are available and accessible to all staff regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity? So you're asked to tick where this applies. So you complete here, you put the X in here, and then we specifically use LGBT inclusive terminology and language in our policies and benefits. So the idea around this question is that that employees know when they're looking at policies and practices that there's LGBT inclusive terminology, that it applies to them. And this isn't about creating new policies, but simply ensuring that the terminology is inclusive. So in terms of the evidence required, again, you see the icon here. And then we're asking to submit a screenshot, so a sample or a line from that policy. So for example, here it's please copy a sentence or 2 from your policy documentation that clearly shows how you define a partner in your policy. So for example, it wouldn't just say spouse, it might say civil partner as well, so that you use inclusive terminology. Also very important to note that if you're a global organisation with global policies, it's really important to show how you respond to that in the Irish context. So how do those policies apply to the Irish part of the business? Finally, a sample question from best practice. and this is from section 1 on diversity leadership, which focuses on the strategic approach to diversity and inclusion, so looking at the LGBT strand of your diversity and inclusion or quality strategy. And the question 1, which of the following does your company have in place to ensure a strategic approach to your work on LGBT equality and D&I? So again, it's please tick all that apply. And for best practice, one of the questions is any of the above strategy, so any of your LGBT diversity and inclusion strategy or action plan that's reviewed at board level. So here we're asking organisations to give evidence of how it's been reviewed at board level. So for example, that might be a screenshot of a board report, and organisations are free to redact sensitive information. We're only looking for the relevant information that shows that at board level that the LGBT diversity and inclusion strategy or agenda has been discussed and progressed. So there was significant learning from 2015, and I'm going to touch on some of those tips to help you along with your application for this year. Again, I mentioned earlier about the time frame, so some organisations lost out when they provided evidence that didn't fit in the time frame, so it's very important to ensure that all of the actions fit into the 1st of January 2015 to the June 30th, 2016 time frame. Sensitive evidence can be redacted. So rather than not providing the evidence, simply redact the information that's not relevant. That's really important. I know some participants last year lost out on that. They felt that they couldn't submit that information. Leadership. So section 1 refers to leadership, and it's very important that you can show and give evidence of how leadership are contributing to the LGBT diversity and inclusion agenda. And specifically senior leaders. So we've been very clear this year to refer to CEOs, country managers, secretary generals, and heads or directors of departments or functions as well. So it's very important to be able to show that that support and engagement rather than simply an organisational engagement. And I'll give you an example of that. For example, an all-staff communication that comes out specifically from a senior leader. So that would fit into a communications part on leadership. If it's simply an organisational one without a senior leader involved in it in some way, either writing the article or writing an email, that's a different piece of information and wouldn't be relevant in this section. We touched on this already as well around global evidence. So supporting evidence must clearly show what impact it has in the Irish context. So for example, the global diversity policy internationally, that you can show how it's been adapted and implemented in Ireland. So often global organisations will have their own diversity and inclusion policy for Ireland specifically, and it ties into the global one. So it's just to be very clear on that if you're a global organisation. So this is a really important point for a lot of organisations. In 2015, a lot of participants submitted an LGBT employee network action plan for their diversity strategy. So we see those as very different. An organisation has a diversity and inclusion strategy with an LGBT strand, and their LGBT employee network will also have an action plan that feeds into that overarching strategy. So it's very important in section 1 to be able to refer to the organisation's LGBT diversity and inclusion element of their strategy. And later on in section 4, organisations who have LGBT employee networks will be able to submit their action plan and strategy. Trans inclusion is incredibly important that organisations can give evidence around this. This is one of the areas where many organisations last year didn't have sufficient evidence around it. In the Irish context, many organisations are just starting to understand their commitment and responsibility to trans employees. So it's an area to consider and focus for this year's application. So having a strong commitment to trans inclusion in your organization, developing or adopting transition guidelines for employees, training line managers and HR staff around, and recruiters indeed, around trans inclusion, and the application as well of transition guidelines is hugely important. So that's something to look out for in this year's application. Section 6, which I mentioned earlier, is an optional section, and it refers to the Leadership Awards. And this is a really important section to recognise people in your organisation that have gone above and beyond driving the LGBT diversity and inclusion agenda. So it's a really great opportunity to recognise those LGBT employee networks, senior leaders, LGBT role models in your organisation, and allies, so people in your organisation that are not LGBT but are really supporting and engaging in that agenda. So the nominations are a separate application section, and they're about 500 words max. GLEN shortlist the highest performing nominations or applications, and an independent panel of judges from across business and human rights adjudicate then or evaluate the shortlisted applicants. The key areas to consider, so some of the areas to focus on for those applications is around vision, so being able to illustrate what the vision is for that senior leader or for the LGBT employee network, to look at leadership as well, to be able to show how they've brought the organisation with them, and to look at what actions, so what tangible pieces of work they've done and how that's impacted the culture of the organisation as well. I think it's very important as well at this point to say to allocate significant time to this section as well. It is the last section, but it's very much worthwhile to take some time out to look at that section individually, or indeed ask one person in your organisation to review that section individually as well. More of the learning around the leadership pieces, as I mentioned, is that it's a standalone application, so really treat it like that. Ensure that the answers are detailed as well, that you're able to give those clear examples around vision, leadership, action and impact, so use that frame of reference to complete it. And the judging panel, this is very important, they don't have access to the rest of the application, so they will only see the shortlisted nominee applications. So all the work that you've included for the rest of the application isn't there, so they won't have that reference, so it's important to really give your best for that section as well. I've just put a sample answer structure together just to give you a sense of what that application or for the nominee for Leadership Awards will look like. So for the LGBT Employee Network of the Year, give some background around the network, its establishment and how it grew, look at the vision, so what is the mission statement of the network itself, their key objectives, what they want to achieve, how they're connecting that to the overall objectives of the business, and look at that engagement piece as well, so how are they engaging internally and changing the culture, and also how they're making an impact externally as well. And then to finish off, to summarise, it's to go back to that impact piece again, so really how have they made a difference to the organisation. This is a piece of best practice around completing the application form, and organisations approach it very differently. I was just speaking to Michelle in AIR earlier, and their approach around it is to put out a call for volunteers as part of their network to join them in a group. And they've split up each section, and they have somebody that's project managing it, so reviewing it as well. And this is really best practice around applying for the index. So cutting it up into manageable chunks. HR might look at the policies and practices piece, they're best placed to do so. The CSR piece and communications piece will go to a CSR person, or indeed people that are in your marketing or communications department, or whoever that person might be. Equally with diverse business, people who are involved in the supplier process, for example, so people who know about supplier policies and tendering. So it's a really really great opportunity to bring in people from across the business to engage them, or from across your organization to engage them in a positive way in the application, and to follow through as well with the awards and then the report card as well to show them the performance and the progress. So when you're applying for the next year, that these people or departments are really engaged in it and see it as a very positive process that they can buy into as well. Finally, there's a piece about applying. So we have two options for applying, either by email, that you can send us your application via email with all of your evidence included in the document, or you can use Dropbox as well. And there's more information about how to apply on the completion guide as well that you can get online at www.workplaceequality.ie. Finally, the very important dates. So of course the deadline is very important, not to miss the date. So it's 30th of June 2016. This gives organisations sufficient time to complete the application form. We've given a good chunk of time from January to June to help organisations along. And certainly if you have questions along the way, please do get in touch with us and we'll be happy to support you around it. The awards are happening in September 20th. So that's a really exciting event and opportunity to come along. Hopefully some of you will also be in the best places to work for LGBT equality in 2016 as well. And it's a really wonderful event. Last year we had it in the Westin with Miriam O'Callaghan, so it's a very significant event for LGBT equality in the workplace every year. Our report cards, they're available in October. And as I said earlier, they'll give you metrics on how you fared in the application process. It's important to note as well that all applications are completely confidential, so we don't publish any organisation's results. So we do name a top or best places to work for LGBT equality, but we don't publish anyone's results. So these are individual report cards that are sent to applicants. And finally then, just to reiterate, it's really great practice to schedule a debrief so we can look at objectives for the coming year as well and support you on that journey, both to improve your score in the index but also to get better results in the coming year on LGBT diversity and inclusion. So now we've come to the end of the presentation part, and if people have questions around applying for the index or possibly questions about the presentation, please feel free to ask. Yes?
Hi, I have a question. So you've got your different sections, your 5 sections are weighted, and we know what they are, but are foundations, next steps, and best practices, are they weighted as well?
Yeah, so for each section, the scores are weighted. So for example, for best practice in questions, obviously it's a better result, so it is weighted, yeah, exactly. So the better, so for example, a question might be around training is a very good example of that. So what percentage of employees are trained or have received LGBT diversity and inclusion training? So if you have 0 to 25%, you're not going to score or do as well as somebody that has 90 to 100%. That's a better result.
So if you're a new, so this is our first submission.
Yes.
And we're very proud. And so for example, we will have certain things in place, but there's obviously things that we would need to do and need to put in place for the next steps.
Yes.
So for us, in some sections, next steps might be our biggest thing. Mm-hmm. But I'm just trying to understand, is it a matter of like, say, it's 33% for each section, or should we really be focusing on trying to set up the foundations in the next 6 months to give that a stronger...
Yeah, I think for organisations that are starting off, it's really important to focus on what you can do. So if you want to achieve foundations, and that's the most important part, you may be able to answer some pieces on next steps, but focusing on foundations is your core goal. Ultimately, for organisations, this is about making them more inclusive. So I think it's perfectly fine to focus on the areas you need to. So if it's foundations, and maybe you have some best practice and next steps, but just focusing on achieving those and building on them year on year is most important. But certainly in terms of best practice, the example of the training questions, they are weighted differently, yes.
It might be just useful to say that allocated 1 point. So if you answer 2 in foundations, 1 in next steps and 1 in best practice, you'll get 4 points for that question. If you answer, if there happens to be 4 best practice answers, doesn't tend to be the case, but let's say there's 4 best practice answers in a particular question, you'll still get 4 points.
Sorry, Mary from AIR. Just a question around just taking on from Mary. You know, when you're actually evaluating, for example, like, are you actually, the person whoever is doing the evaluation, say, Cara, is she going to take a link to the strategy, how the foundation is actually going to link to the corporate strategy or the DFI strategy? Because where you actually see, like, where at what stage the organization is at. For example, AIR is at that foundation stage, or focus is going to be mainly on the foundation. So do you actually link that back to the strategy?
So that's a really good question. So the way the scoring works is that it's scored in-house in GLEN. So we individually score each application. So we do it separately, and then we come together to look at the differences around that, and then we look at, you know, where the points will be allocated as well. So there's these checks. So if it's done individually, each person isn't giving more or less points to one person. So we have those checks in place internally in GLEN, and then the external evaluator is evaluating our scoring against the index. So that's an added check that, for example, that when Cara's looking at the scoring, she says, okay, this organization scored this point here, and that's fair, that makes sense. And if there is anything missing, that she brings that up with us. So she's evaluating our scoring rather than the applications themselves. Does anyone have any other questions around the process of completing the index? Or, yeah, Aoife?
Robert from Trinity College. I was just wondering, in section 6 on your leaders, does the 18-month time frame still apply, that you shouldn't really be referring to actions taken before January 2015?
Yeah, exactly. So it's the 18-month period for the whole index, including the leadership awards as well. Yeah. Yes?
The leadership awards as well, we nominated last year, so we nominate the same people again, or be advised?
So for the leadership awards, if you participated in 2015, you can certainly nominate the same leaders or employee networks, and the LGBT employee network again. The information will just have to be up to date, so what they've done in that time period. Yes?
Hi. So with the examples that you want, so the evidence, where it says, you know, just a screen grab of the 2 lines that refer to the answers, do you need to see the whole page and with that section highlighted so that you can see the actual document, or is it literally just a screen grab of the 2 lines?
Yeah, so it's useful to give a bit of context if you can. It doesn't have to be the whole document, but if it's a screen grab so we know that it's part of that policy, that's far more useful, and it's easier for us then to see that. For example, if it were a screen grab of a Word document and there was no date or there was no reference to what it was, that isn't as useful to us. It's harder then to allocate marks to that. So generally best practice and some of our organisations that were listed in the best place to work, they gave great evidence where they would give a screenshot of the document and they'd highlight the actual piece. Now, or if it's at the top of the document, just give that piece. But there's no need to give a full policy document or to attach that. Yeah. So for section 5 on diverse business, looking at supplier policy, we look for an example of that policy. So it might be a screenshot of that policy that says that your suppliers are also compliant and they have sexual orientation and gender identity in their policies as well. If you've done training, for example, or you've invited them to an event, that could be a piece of evidence for the relevant question as well. So it's one piece of evidence for each question generally. Yeah, Keith?
Keith Hunt from Deutsche Bank. You were saying that the timeframes for this resubmission are now until June 2016.
Mm-hmm.
If you use content from this year for this year's application, can you reuse that next year then?
So the time frame has been expanded a little bit because report cards are available in October. So in 2015, the report cards were issued in October, which only gave organisations a little bit of time in 2015, so really November and December, to action new initiatives around LGBT diversity and inclusion. Next year we'll be moving back to a 12-month calendar, and it'll be from June to June. So it'll be information from after the 30th of June to the next year. Yes?
Does evidence have to be a JPEG, or can we submit video evidence?
Yeah, you can certainly submit a link to a video. So in some instances, it's a screenshot. It can be photographs of an event. It can be a link to a video. Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else have any burning questions? Yes?
Is this presentation available? Sorry. They've asked the wrong person, honestly. Is this presentation available online? Because there were some really good reference points.
Yeah, we will make this available online as well. So we'll put a link on our website.
Oh, look, if I'm being painful, just tell me to stop. I like the idea of being able to submit a link, because then we can obviously put our own page up, and then everyone can upload into that, and we can keep it clear. If we do go via a link, and I don't know if you can answer this now or not, but would there be a preference as to how it is, or as long as you can access it, anything's fine?
So, I mean, a link to access a video is fine. Preferably a screenshot of information is the best. So we did get some links last year, and we found some of them were broken for whatever reason, so it's probably safer to stick with a screenshot. Videos, of course, do send us on a link.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
And just to reiterate again, if people have questions when they're going through the application, sometimes that, questions come up then, feel free to get in touch, and we'll be happy to help you or support you as much as we can around that.
Just a question, last question for me is, in terms of comparison to the person who were actually the company won last year on the WI, what differentiated them in terms of comparison to the rest of the organizations? Do you have 1 or 2 points we can actually have?
Yeah, so organization.
You might just repeat the question
Yeah.
for those in the webinar.
Sure. So the question was, what differentiated the organisations that were in the best places to work for LGBT equality, so the top 5 employers, from the other applicants? One was that actually it was down to the completion of their forms. So these organisations were providing the relevant evidence that was within the time frame. And for the leadership awards as well, they gave detailed nominations, so they really treated them as standalone applications. So that was really, really important. For organisations that were listed in the top 5 last year, there was a threshold. So organisations that scored total marks in foundation and next steps were named in the top 5. So that's how they were entered into the list.
Sorry, so section 6 is optional, but it just sounds like it also impacts the way you're measured as the entire submission. Is that correct?
So section 6 is specifically for the leadership awards. So it's only measured for the leadership awards, and section 1 to 5 measures organisations, and then if they succeed, they'll be included in the best places to work for LGBT equality, so that list. So they're 2 separate pieces. Yeah.
You mentioned that the last 20% earning might be extended out to top 10 organizations.
Yeah, so that depends on the threshold again. So.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, excuse me. So the question was whether we would be expanding the list from a top 5 to a top 10 for 2016. And that very much depends on the quality of the submissions and whether organisations reach the threshold. So organisations that score, the total marks for foundations and next steps was 74 points. So organisations that scored above that were included in the list for best place to work. So we're hopeful that there will be a larger list this year, that more organisations will achieve higher points in foundations and next steps.
So, Emer, how many entries
Yes.
did you have last year?
Last year we had 15 entries, and a third of them were from the public sector. So this year we've also already had a number of organisations that have committed to do it, as well as the ones last year. So we're very excited about new entries and also about more public sector organisations competing and applying this year. Did you have a question? Yes.
Just want to ask about diversity culture and just the marking again. So I think we're planning in AIR like several different initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way down you were saying kind of like that just you kind of just want one piece of evidence. Now if we submit something that we think is a great piece of evidence and we're selecting one of 5, and then you think, well, actually no, that doesn't qualify. You kind of, I don't know how you do it, like do you kind of feed that back to the organisation and you say, actually no, that was just one we picked. Here's another better example, and you say, oh no, that's actually okay.
Do you mean during the process or?
During the process, let's say during the kind of, we're submitting something, and you say, okay, well, we keep that one back, we don't think that actually qualifies.
So the question was whether an organisation when an organisation submits a piece of evidence and it's not the relevant piece of evidence, whether we get in touch with them and let them know that. So we don't do that. An organisation chooses which piece of evidence they want to submit. And the feedback we give them is in the executive debrief, so we let them know, we give them tips around the evidence they submitted, the quality of it, and where they can do better for next year. So we don't contact any participants during the submission and scoring stage. So it's really up to organisations and participants to choose that evidence wisely.
If we had a doubt about a piece of evidence and we had to choice between 2 or 3 in the process up to June, would it be okay to contact you and get an opinion on that?
We can certainly give you examples of good evidence or clarify a question for you. Certainly we can do that, absolutely.
Sorry, in relation to
Yeah.
that, if I have 3 pieces of evidence, won't actually kind of give all 3 and then you pick the best?
Yeah, certainly if you have more than one.
Can I just repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, Susan. So Keith was wondering whether you can submit more than one piece of evidence, and then the evaluator will pick the relevant piece of evidence. So going on last year's participants, some organisations may have submitted 2 pieces of evidence, and generally they were the relevant ones, but we would pick the one that we won't deduct marks if there's one piece of evidence that isn't relevant. However, most of the questions are very straightforward. So, for example, an all-staff email on LGBT inclusion from leadership. So people will submit that piece of information. So we've tried to make the questions as straightforward as possible, and this year we've also included in the evidence section, we've specifically required for some of the questions that might be a little bit trickier, we've given kind of tips of exactly what evidence we're looking for to guide you along the way.
Could I just comment on that? It might be useful just to let you know it's a pretty rigorous process that we're involved in from our side, going through 133 questions across X number of applications. So there is a little bit of help us to help you in terms of how focused, how well put together, how legible your application is. So certainly giving us one focused answer rather than pick from 3 would certainly make our job a lot easier and ultimately will make your application more effective, I would say.
Yeah. And actually another piece around that is that we have, just to note for anyone that participated last year, we've moved to solely digital applications. So the submission is digital. Last year we had hard copies, but we're moving to email and Dropbox just to avoid any confusion around pieces that aren't legible or evidence that isn't clear. Yes? So the question is whether you can duplicate evidence in your submission. So most of the questions are designed that you won't be able to duplicate evidence. Some of the policy questions you may have to refer to evidence in 2 questions. I would say not to use the same evidence again where possible. Organizations that are duplicating the evidence, it won't be relevant to each of the questions. So best practice will be just to use that one piece of evidence for the specific question. Are there any other questions that come to mind? So then I guess I'll wish you the best. Oh, there is one more question. Yeah.
Apologies, Mark, here again. Someone kind of mentions like actively promote, this is kind of like in the diversity culture, actively promote existing general programs to LGBT staff, and like review, take up personal career development opportunities among LGBT staff. Like here in AIR, we would like all opportunities available to everyone. So again, are you looking for something that's specifically developing, I don't know, like our network staff or something, or I don't know.
So the question is around professional development opportunities and how you communicate them to LGBT staff. So for one example of evidence that you could give there is channeling that through the LGBT employee network. So the LGBT employee network might communicate those professional development opportunities. That's one. Another question is around LGBT inclusive professional development opportunities. So there are specific opportunities for LGBT employees. Some organizations, for example, might have an LGBT strand to their mentoring program, for example, where LGBT senior leaders might mentor other staff. So that could be an example of professional development as well that's targeted specifically at the LGBT population in your workforce. Are there any other questions that spring to mind? You're all set to succeed in the Workplace Equality Index 2016. Well, then I wish you the best of luck in your application. And again, please get in touch if you have any questions, even if it's just one specific question about one section, do get in touch and we'd be happy to help. Thank you.